The struggle for survival in the ruins of a broken world, where the sky was always gray and the ground was cracked with hunger, a girl crawled, weak and desperate. Her name was not important anymore. She had forgotten it long ago, just like she had forgotten the warmth of a home or the sound of laughter. All that mattered now was survival. Her hands, bruised and scratched, scraped along the cold ground as she dragged her body through the debris. Every breath she took felt like a struggle, each step heavier than the last. She was small, thin, barely more than a shadow of a person. Her clothes were torn and dirty, the color of dust and ash. She had no strength left. She was just another survivor, fighting for scraps in a world that no longer cared. She saw something ahead, half buried in the dirt. Scraps. Her eyes widened, and her heart raced. It wasn't much, just a few pieces of burnt bread, some old bones, and what looked like the remains of a meal someone had left behind. But it was food. It was everything. Her body trembled as she reached for it, fingers shaking with hunger. Just as her hand touched the bread, a growl broke the silence. She froze, instinctively pulling her hand back. Her eyes darted around, searching for the source of the sound. A large dog, thin and wild, emerged from the shadows. Its fur was matted and dirty, its eyes gleaming with hunger. It saw the girl and the scraps she had found, and it didn't hesitate. With a snarl, it lunged forward, teeth bared, ready to fight for its meal. The girl scrambled backward, her breath coming in short gasps. She had no weapon, no strength to defend herself, but she would not give up the food. She had fought too long to let a dog take it from her. The dog snapped its jaws, and she instinctively raised her arm to block. The sharp pain of its teeth sinking into her skin made her gasp. She cried out, but she didn't let go. Her fingers wrapped around the food tightly, determined. She had to survive. She would not lose. With a roar, the dog twisted its head, trying to pull the scraps away. The girl cried out in pain, feeling the blood spill from her arm. But she fought back, her hand still clutching the bread. Her face was contorted with pain and anger, but she would not lose. The struggle felt endless. The dog's teeth were sharp, tearing through her flesh, but she refused to back down. Every time it tugged at the scraps, she pulled them back. Her blood mixed with the dirt, staining the ground around her. Finally, after what felt like hours, the dog stepped back, growling. The girl's hand trembled, but she still held the food tightly. Her arm was bleeding badly now, the wound deep, but she had won. The dog growled one last time before slinking off into the shadows, defeated. It had lost, but the girl hadn't won much. She had only just held on. She collapsed onto the ground, breathing heavily, her arm throbbing with pain. The food was hers, but at what cost? She knew she couldn't keep fighting like this forever. The world was a harsh place, and every day was a battle for survival. She had won this fight, but there would be more. There always were. She sat up slowly, her body shaking with exhaustion. The bread tasted like nothing, too dry and bitter in her mouth, but it was all she had. She ate quickly, barely chewing, as though the act of eating itself would make her stronger. Her eyes wandered to her arm where the blood was still dripping. The wound was deep and she knew it could get infected. Infection could be worse than hunger. If she didn't get help soon, she might not survive the next fight. But for now, all she could do was keep moving. Keep crawling. Keep surviving. She looked around at the broken world, the twisted metal and crumbled buildings that were once cities. Now they were just tombs, places where people had once lived and laughed and dreamed. She could still hear the echoes of those lives, like whispers, in the wind. But there was no one left to hear. The world had moved on, and she was just one more survivor. She wiped the blood from her face, her eyes empty of hope. There was no one to help her here, no one who cared. She was alone, but that was how it had always been. The world had no place for kindness. It only had room for the strong. Her body ached, but she couldn't stop. She had to keep going. There was no choice. If she stopped, if she let herself rest, she might never wake up again. and she wasn't ready to die yet. Not here. Not in this broken world. She got to her feet slowly, her legs shaky, and glanced over her shoulder one last time before continuing down the ruined streets. Her arm hurt with every step, but she pushed through the pain. There was no time for weakness. The world might have forgotten her, but she would not forget it. She would keep fighting. She would survive. It was the only thing she knew how to do. The wound. The world around her was quiet now. The growling of the dog had faded, and the only sound was the distant wind that whispered through the ruins. But for the girl, the silence was deafening. She could feel the sharp sting in her arm where the dog's teeth had sunk deep. Blood oozed slowly, soaking into her torn sleeves, dripping onto the cold earth below her. Each drop felt like a countdown to something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Her breath was shallow and ragged as she looked down at the bloodied wound. It was painful, worse than anything she had felt before, but she had learned to ignore pain. She had no choice but to push it down, to keep moving. Pain was a luxury she could not afford. The world had taught her that long ago. But this was different. The bleeding wouldn't stop, and she could feel the darkness creeping at the edges of her vision. It was the coldness of her body fighting to keep what little life it had left. She had to do something. Slowly, painfully, she pulled herself up, her legs trembling beneath her weight. The scraps of food she had fought so hard for were still clutched tightly in her other hand. But she didn't eat right away. The hunger was still there, gnawing at her insides, but the pain from her wound demanded her attention. She staggered forward, moving instinctively. The streets around her were desolate. There was nothing here but dust, broken glass, and twisted metal. The few buildings that still stood were hollow shells of what they once were, their windows shattered, their walls crumbling. A once thriving city was now nothing more than a graveyard of forgotten lives. Her head swam, the world spinning as the blood continued to flow from her arm. She took a few shaky steps, then collapsed against the side of a broken wall, her legs too weak to carry her any further. The cool stone felt rough against her skin, but it was a small comfort in the chaos of her mind. She stared at the wound, her vision blurring. It was getting worse. The blood was dark, thick, and the edges of the gash were starting to swell. Infection was her next enemy, and she could already feel the telltale signs, the burning heat creeping into her skin, the dizziness that threatened to pull her under. She needed help, but help didn't exist in this world anymore. She gritted, her teeth refusing to give in. If she wanted to survive, she had to keep moving. There was no time to waste. The hunger was still there, gnawing at her stomach, but the wound was the bigger threat now. She reached into her pockets, pulling out whatever scraps she had left, bits of cloth, old rags, torn fabric, and tried to bind her arm. Her fingers were clumsy, shaking from both the blood loss and exhaustion. The cloth was barely enough to cover the wound, and it wouldn't stop the bleeding for long. She needed something better, something real. But there was nothing here. No clean bandages, no medicine. She had no choice but to hope that her makeshift bandage would hold long enough for her to find a place where she could rest. She tied it tightly, then collapsed onto the cold, cracked ground, leaning against the wall for support. Her eyes closed, and for a moment, the world seemed to slip away. The pain faded, the hunger dulled, and she could almost pretend that she was somewhere else, somewhere safer, warmer. But the moment passed as quickly as it had come, and the reality of her situation returned with full force. She was alone. She was wounded, and she was still far from safety. The darkness in her vision grew stronger, but she refused to succumb to it. She pushed herself up again, her body shaking with the effort. She had to keep going. She couldn't stop. She had been through worse. She had survived worse. But this wound, this pain, was different. She could feel the weight of it in her bones, the heavy pull of weakness that threatened to drag her down. For a moment she thought about the life she had lost, the life she once knew. A family, a home, a future. But those memories were fading, slipping away like sand through her fingers. The world had changed, and she had to change with it. There was no place for the past anymore. There was only survival. She took a deep breath, then pushed herself back onto her feet. Her legs wobbled, but she didn't fall. Not yet. She looked around, scanning the streets for any sign of shelter, any place where she could rest. There had to be something, anything. Her eyes landed on a building in the distance, its silhouette barely visible against the gray sky. It wasn't much, but it was something. She took a few more steps, each one slower than the last, her body protesting with every movement. The wound burned with every step, but she ignored it. She had no choice. The building seemed closer now, but the path to it felt endless. Every step felt like a mile, and she wondered if she was even going to make it. But the thought of lying down in the cold, unfeeling dirt was worse than the pain. The hunger was still there, clawing at her insides, but she kept moving. She had to. Finally, after what felt like hours, she reached the building. It was a shell, but it offered shelter from the wind. She stumbled inside, her vision fading. Her body was weak, her mind foggy. She leaned against the wall, sinking to the floor, as her world turned black. The last thing she remembered before slipping into unconsciousness was the taste of blood on her lips and the feeling of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. And then, everything went silent. The Watcher. The wind howled through the empty streets, sending dust swirling into the air like ghosts of the past. The world had been silent for so long that the girl had almost forgotten what it felt like to hear anything. The echo of her own breath was the only sound that mattered now. Each breath felt heavier than the last as she huddled against the cracked wall, her body trembling. Not just from the cold, but from something deeper. Something primal. She had almost given up when she heard it. A soft crackle, the faintest sound, of footsteps against the rubble. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't alone. The instinct to hide kicked in immediately, her body reacting before her mind could catch up. But her legs were weak, and her head was spinning from the blood loss. She couldn't move quickly enough. Her hand instinctively went to her wound, the pain sharp and fresh. The makeshift bandage was soaked through, and the blood was still leaking slowly, staining her torn clothes. She pressed her back into the wall, trying to make herself as small as possible, as though she could disappear into the shadows. She didn't want to be seen. She didn't want anyone to find her, especially not now. The footsteps came closer, slow and steady, like someone who wasn't in a hurry. They stopped just out of her sight and the air grew still. She held her breath, not daring to move. She couldn't see them yet, but she could feel the presence of someone watching her. The feeling made the hairs on the back of her neck stand, on end, a cold shiver running down her spine. For a long moment, nothing happened. She waited, heart pounding, her pulse throbbing in her ears. Had they seen her? Were they waiting for her to make a sound? She didn't dare look up, didn't dare give away her position. But then, just as the tension in the air became unbearable, she heard something else. A soft cough. It was a human sound. The realization hit her like a thunderclap. Someone was out there. Someone human. She squeezed her eyes shut, hoping she was wrong, hoping it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But then, another sound. Footsteps again, much closer this time, accompanied by the crunch of gravel under boots. And then, the unmistakable sound of something scraping against the ground, the rustle of cloth. The figure had moved. Her heart thudded in her chest. She couldn't stay here. She had to move, but her body refused to obey. Her legs were too weak, her vision too blurred, her head spinning from the blood loss. She was trapped, unable to escape, unable to fight. The figure appeared around the corner of the building, their silhouette framed by the dim light. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a rugged face that looked worn and tired as though he had seen too much. His clothes were practical, dark, weathered, and torn. The same kind of clothing that spoke of survival, not luxury. A soldier. A survivor like her. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he watched her from a distance, his expression unreadable. The girl instinctively flinched, her body tensing as if expecting an attack. She couldn't tell if he meant to harm her or not, but she was ready for whatever came next. For a long time, they just stared at each other. The girl could see the faint flicker of curiosity in his eyes. But there was something else too, a kind of recognition, as though he understood exactly what she was going through. The silence stretched on, heavy and thick. Then finally the man broke the quiet. "You're hurt," he said, his voice low and steady. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. His eyes flicked to her arm, where the blood was still, seeping through the bandages. He seemed to hesitate for a moment as though considering something. "I can help you." The word sounded foreign to her. Help. It had been so long since anyone had offered help, the girl didn't know how to respond. The offer felt both like a lifeline and a threat all at once. She had learned long ago not to trust anyone, especially not strangers. People in this world only took what they needed, and they didn't care if you lived or died. But this man, he didn't seem like the others. There was something different about him. His eyes weren't cold or hungry. They were tired, but there was something else. A sense of compassion, maybe? Or was it pity? She couldn't tell. She narrowed her eyes, her instinct telling her to be cautious. "Why would you help me?" Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, as though speaking might break the fragile peace between them. He shrugged, a simple gesture, as though the answer didn't matter. "Because you need it, and because I know what it's like to be alone." The girl wasn't sure what to make of that. She didn't know who he was or why he was here. But there was no time for questions. Her body was failing her. She could feel the dizziness creeping back in, the edges of her vision fading once again. "Come on," the man said, stepping closer. His hand reached out, offering something she couldn't quite make out. A water flask, maybe. She hesitated, torn between fear and exhaustion, but then her body betrayed her. Her legs gave way beneath her and she collapsed to the ground, her vision blurring completely. She heard the man's voice again, distant this time, though his words were clear. "Stay with me," he said, kneeling beside her. "You're not alone anymore." And then everything went dark. The approach. The world was fading around her. Her mind was heavy, clouded by the blood loss, her body a constant ache of exhaustion. Everything felt like it was slipping away, as though her very life was being pulled out of her thread by thread. But then she felt something gentle, something real. A cool hand on her shoulder. She flinched at first, instinctively recoiling from the touch. Her body was already on alert, every sense heightened by fear and the lingering pain. But the hand didn't press, didn't pull her. It was just there, steady, patient, easy. The man's voice came, low and soothing, like a calm whisper on a windy day. "You're safe. You're not alone." She blinked, trying to clear the fog in her mind. Her eyelids felt heavy, as if they had become too tired to stay open. But she pushed through the fog, forcing her eyes to focus. There, above her, was the man from earlier. His face softened with concern, his gaze steady and calm. The way he was looking at her wasn't the way others had looked at her before. No hunger in his eyes, no calculation, no intent to harm. Only something she had forgotten. Kindness. She couldn't trust him. Not yet. Not after everything she had been through. She had learned the hard way that trust was a dangerous thing in this world. People didn't offer help unless they wanted something in return. But something about him was different. His hands were gentle as they adjusted the makeshift bandage around her arm, as if he understood what it felt like to be broken. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" His voice was soft, more of a statement than a question. She didn't answer. It wasn't a question she could answer. Not yet. The man adjusted the bandage around her arm, tightening it with care. She winced as he touched the wound, but it wasn't as painful as it had been earlier. He was taking care of her, in a way that felt so foreign to her now. It made her stomach twist with both gratitude and fear. "You need food," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "I've got some supplies nearby. I'll take you there. You need to eat and rest." She shook her head weakly. "No, I can't. I can't go with you." Her words came out in a strained rasp, but they were clear enough. The thought of going with him terrified her. There was no safety in this world, no sanctuary. People couldn't be trusted. Not anymore. He didn't argue, though. He simply nodded, his expression unwavering. "You don't have to go far, I'll bring it to you." He left for a moment, his footsteps disappearing into the distance, and the girl let out a long, shaky breath. Her body was betraying her, her vision still swimming with dizziness. She closed her eyes just for a second, but the second stretched, on longer than she expected. She had to fight this. She couldn't let herself fall asleep, not here, not in the open, not in front of someone she didn't know. She needed to stay alert. She leaned back against the cold concrete wall, shivering despite the warmth of the day. The pain in her arm was still there, but it was duller now, numbed by the pressure of the bandage. She felt the hunger gnawing at her again, louder now that the fight had left her. Her stomach churned, empty and hollow. She hadn't eaten properly in days, maybe longer. Her thoughts were foggy, but her instincts remained sharp. She couldn't afford to trust anyone, no matter how kind they seemed. He could be leading her into a trap. He could take advantage of her weakness. People like him, survivors, didn't help for free. But then again, what if he was telling the truth? What if he was just another lost soul, trying to survive in a world that had long since stopped caring about anyone? Her mind spiraled in circles, the uncertainty gnawing at her insides. She wanted to scream at herself, to force herself to think clearly. But it was too much. Everything was too much. The man returned a few minutes later, holding a small bag. It was old, patched up in places, but it was filled with something, the faint rustling of rations. He knelt down beside her again, his movements careful, his gaze steady. "Here," he said, pulling out a small packet of dried food. It was a mixture of something, maybe meat, maybe vegetables. She couldn't tell. The smell hit her immediately. It wasn't much, but it was food. Her mouth watered instinctively. She hadn't eaten anything real in so long. The man held the food out to her, but she didn't reach for it right away. She looked at him, searching his eyes, trying to read him. Her stomach twisted painfully. "I'm not asking for anything in return," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle. "I'm just trying to keep you alive." She stared at the food in his hand, her fingers twitching, her body screaming for sustenance, but her mind kept warning her to be cautious, to stay guarded. Why? Her voice was barely a whisper, barely a breath. The man didn't hesitate. "Because I've been where you are. I know what it's like to be alone, to be afraid, to have no one but yourself." His eyes softened. "And I won't let you die out here." His words cut through her like a knife. The quiet honesty in his voice made something stir deep inside her. A flicker of hope, something she hadn't felt in so long. She took the food from him then, her hands trembling. As she tore open the packet and took her first bite, she didn't care about the uncertainty anymore. She didn't care about the danger. All she cared about was that this moment, this strange moment of kindness, felt real. The food was dry, but it tasted like life itself, like a chance. And in that fleeting, fragile moment, she realized something. She wasn't alone. Not anymore, but that realization also terrified her, because it meant that, for the first time in a long time, she had something to lose. The gift. The sun had long since dipped behind the broken skyline, leaving the world bathed in a cold, pale light. The girl sat against the crumbling wall, the last of her strength drained, but her mind still buzzed with the questions she couldn't silence. The man had returned with food, enough to settle her gnawing hunger for the moment. She had eaten slowly, savoring the taste of the dried meat and the stale bread, though it hardly made up for the days she had gone without. Now, with the small meal inside her, her body began to feel the weight of exhaustion. Her head was heavy, her limbs sore from the days of wandering. But there was something more, something deeper. It wasn't just hunger or pain. It was the dawning realization that for the first time in a long while, she might not have to face this world alone. The man had moved a few feet away, setting up a small camp near the remnants of an old building. He hadn't spoken much, but his actions spoke volumes. His movements were purposeful, efficient. He wasn't rushing, but he wasn't wasting time either. His gaze flicked over her every now and then, as though checking to make sure she was still with him, still breathing. The girl's body was craving sleep, but her mind was awake, too awake. She couldn't shut out the memories, the pain, the doubts. She stared at the ground, at the cracked earth beneath her. The quiet was almost too much. She had been alone for so long that the sound of another person's breathing, the rustle of their movements, made her heart race with unease. Here, the man's voice cut through the silence. It was steady, calm, but it carried an unspoken command. She turned her head, her eyes flicking to him. He was kneeling on the ground, a small bundle of cloth in his hands. It wasn't much, just a few pieces of cloth, perhaps torn from old clothes, wrapped neatly. The corners of the cloth were stained, but the fabric was clean, unlike the rags she wore. He held it out to her, his eyes steady but kind. "You need a proper bandage. That wound's going to get worse if you don't take care of it." The girl hesitated, looking at the offering. She wasn't used to accepting things from anyone, especially not from a stranger. But this felt different. Her eyes flickered down to the wound on her arm, the patchwork bandages she had hastily tied earlier, and a sick feeling churned in her stomach. She knew he was right. The infection was spreading, and if she didn't treat it soon, the consequences would be worse than hunger. "Why are you doing this?" Her voice was a whisper, barely audible, but the question had been haunting her since the moment he'd found her. There had to be a reason. People didn't help for free in this world. Everyone had an agenda. He didn't flinch at her question. He simply shrugged, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because I know what it feels like to be on the edge, to feel like there's no one left. I was where you are now once." His voice grew quieter, as though he was speaking more to himself than to her. "I lost everything, people I loved, everything I knew, and I had to fight for every day I kept breathing, but I survived, and I don't want you to make the same mistakes I did." The girl felt something stir inside her, a strange, foreign sensation. Hope? Or was it pity? She wasn't sure, but it was enough to make her reach out and take the bundle from him. The soft cloth felt strange in her hands, but it was a comfort, a small kindness in a world that had forgotten how to give. She unwrapped the cloth slowly, revealing a small kit of supplies, bandages, antiseptic, and even a small vial of what looked like medicine. The sight of it made her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had ever hoped for, more than she had ever expected anyone to offer. "Sit up," the man said, his tone gentle but firm. "Let me help you." The girl didn't argue. She couldn't. Her body was too weak, too spent to fight him. She shifted, sitting up against the wall, wincing as her arm throbbed. Her eyes remained on the small kit as the man moved behind her, his hand steady as he carefully unwrapped the bandage from her arm. His touch was surprisingly gentle, nothing like she had expected from someone who had likely seen the worst of the world. There was no urgency in his actions, no impatience. It was as if he were tending to something fragile, something worth saving. And maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to believe that she was. The antiseptic stung as he applied it to her wound, but she didn't flinch. She was used to the pain by now. What she wasn't used to was the care, the tenderness with which he wrapped the fresh bandages around her arm, securing them tightly, ensuring that they would hold. The simple act of taking care of her made something inside her shift, a crack in the armor she had built around herself. "There," he said once he finished, standing back to look at his work. "That should keep the infection at bay, for now." She looked down at her arm. The bandages were clean, fresh, and the throbbing pain had lessened significantly. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And in this broken world, enough was all anyone could hope for. "Why did you help me?" she asked again, her voice quieter now, more curious than accusatory. The man stood up, dusting his hands off. He didn't answer right away, and for a moment, the silence stretched between them. But then he spoke, his voice soft, almost regretful. "Because we're not meant to survive alone," he said. "We never were." For the first time, she let herself believe it. The weight of his words hung in the air between them, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she allowed herself to feel something other than fear. She allowed herself to feel connected. She looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't trust yet, not fully, but it was something real. And for the first time, she allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had believed. The bond, the days seemed to blur together, each one a struggle against the weight of hunger, pain, and uncertainty. Yet somehow, with each passing day, the girl felt a shift, a subtle but undeniable change. It was as if, bit by bit, the walls she had built around herself were beginning to crumble. And it was all because of him. The man, he had never told her his name, and she hadn't asked, had been taking care of her. His presence had become a constant, his quiet demeanor a steady anchor in the chaotic, broken world they inhabited. She had learned to trust his actions more than his words. Every morning he would return with more food, more supplies, and more gentle care for her wounds. He never questioned her, never pushed her to talk. He simply helped. She didn't know when it had started, but at some point, the pain of her body had faded into the background, overshadowed by something else. She began to feel something unfamiliar, a tug in her chest whenever she saw him, a longing she couldn't quite name. It was a strange, tentative kind of trust. No, not just trust. It was something more. The nights, especially, were different. They spent them in silence, sitting close to the small fire he had managed to start, the crackling flames casting dancing shadows on the crumbling walls around them. He never asked her to speak, and she never felt the need to. The quiet was comfortable. Tonight, however, something was different. The girl sat near the fire, her knees drawn to her chest, her fingers absently tracing the scars on her arms. The flames flickered and popped, throwing warmth into the cold air. She had been watching him for the past few moments, her eyes lingering on the way his movements were careful, deliberate. He was preparing something, perhaps more food, or maybe making some adjustments to their shelter. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she'd seen a person do something for themselves. Not to survive, not to get by, but just because they wanted to. She had been so focused on getting through each day, on surviving, that she had forgotten the simple act of living. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, didn't seem to be running from something or looking over his shoulder. For the first time since the world had fallen apart, he seemed at peace. "Are you ever afraid?" she asked suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. The question had been on her mind for a while, but tonight it slipped out without her even thinking about it. The man looked up from his task, his face softening as he met her gaze. There was a moment of stillness before he responded, as though he were carefully considering his words. "Fear is a part of life," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I think, in a way, it keeps us alive. But it doesn't control me anymore, not the way it used to." She nodded slowly, her fingers still tracing the patterns in the dirt, but her thoughts were elsewhere, lingering on his words. It was strange, hearing him speak with such calm certainty. She had never been that way. Fear had always been her constant companion, lurking just beneath the surface, guiding her every decision, every step she took. But this man, this stranger who had offered her food, care, and shelter without expecting anything in return, he wasn't afraid of anything, not anymore. She didn't know how to respond to that. She wasn't ready to admit her own fears, not to him, not to anyone. But as much as she tried to push it away, there was something inside her that longed for that same peace he had found. A small, quiet part of her wanted to believe that fear didn't have to rule her life, that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this world than survival. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. The girl stole glances at him, her eyes lingering on the way he moved, the way his face softened as he worked. She had never realized how much she had needed someone like him until now. It wasn't just that he kept her alive. It was that, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. "Why are you helping me?" she asked again, this time with more force, her voice cracking slightly. She had asked before, but this time the question felt different. There was something vulnerable in her tone that she couldn't hide, something raw and honest. The man set down the small bundle of supplies he had been preparing and looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Because I've been where you are," he said, his voice low, almost distant. "I've lost everything, and I know how it feels to be at the end of the line, with no one to turn to. But I also know that you don't have to fight alone." She looked at him, searching his face for something, anything that would make sense of his words. There was something about him that was different. Something about the way he spoke, the way he moved, made her believe him. He wasn't like anyone else she had ever met. "You've been through it too," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She wasn't sure if she was asking or stating a fact, but he nodded anyway. "I've seen what this world can do to people. It can break you. It can make you forget who you are, what you're fighting for. But I didn't let it take me. And I don't want it to take you, either." The weight of his words settled over her like a blanket, heavy with understanding. She didn't say anything for a long time, just sat there trying to process everything he had just told her. For the first time since the world had fallen apart, she didn't feel like she was on the edge of something. She didn't feel like the darkness was swallowing her whole. She felt like she could breathe, and in that moment she realized something else. He wasn't just helping her survive. He was helping her live. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the hope that had been buried deep inside her, hidden beneath layers of fear and pain. The bond between them was slow to form, but it was there, undeniable in its quiet strength. She wasn't alone anymore. Not anymore. The revelation. The air had turned colder, a chill settling in as the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the horizon. The world around them was cloaked in darkness, the ruins of the once thriving city now nothing more than a distant memory, swallowed by time and decay. The fire between them crackled quietly, its warmth a small comfort against the biting wind. The girl sat cross-legged near the fire, her gaze focused on the dancing flames. The warmth of the fire was soothing, but her mind remained restless, filled with the ghosts of her past. For days now, she had been living beside the man, this stranger who had, against all odds, given her a chance. He had fed her, tended to her wounds, and kept her company in the silence of the ruined world. Yet there was something she had never told him, something she hadn't been able to bring herself to say even now, when the night stretched on and they sat together in the quiet. She knew he had been through pain. She could see it in the way he moved, the way he spoke. But he had never asked about her, never pried into her past, and that was both a blessing and a curse. She hadn't had the strength to open up, but now, in the silence of the night, the weight of her secrets pressed down on her chest. She couldn't carry them forever, not if she wanted to move forward. "Why did you come to help me?" The question had been eating away at her for days. Tonight, the words slipped from her lips without hesitation, cutting through the quiet like a knife. "You don't even know me." The man didn't look at her right away. His gaze was distant, focused on the fire, the flickering orange light casting shadows on his face. His silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke of unspoken understanding, the kind that only grew between two people who had shared the same broken world. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, as though he had already anticipated the question. "I didn't know you," he said, his voice low. "But I knew your kind. I've seen people like you, fighting for scraps, surviving on the edge of despair. I've been there too. I've been that person alone in the world fighting for one more day. His words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face, trying to understand. There was no arrogance in his words, no sense of superiority, only empathy, and it made something in her chest ache, something she had long buried, something she hadn't realized she still had. You don't have to hide anymore, he continued, his gaze finally meeting hers. You don't have to fight alone. We've all lost something, but we don't have to keep losing. The girl swallowed hard. His words were like a lifeline, but she couldn't bring herself to reach for it. Not yet. There was still a part of her that couldn't let go of the fear, the distrust that had been her constant companion for so long. She had learned the hard way that people couldn't be trusted, not in this world. But in his eyes, she saw something different. Something she hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. I don't know how to go on without them, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The words felt like they were ripping through her chest, tearing at the scarred places inside her. I don't know how to keep moving when everything I loved is gone. The man didn't speak for a long moment. He just sat there, watching her, his face unreadable. And then, slowly, he stood and walked over to her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was enough. He stood in front of her, his face serious, his eyes unwavering. You don't have to, he said. You don't have to do it alone. Her heart pounded in her chest. She felt the weight of his words, felt the pressure building in her chest, threatening to burst open. Her past, her memories, they had always been a prison holding her in place. But now, for the first time, there was a crack in the walls, and it was terrifying. Who are you? She asked suddenly, the question tumbling out before she could stop it. What do you want from me? The man smiled, a small, almost sad smile. I'm just a person who's seen too much. I don't want anything from you. I'm not here to take. I'm here to give, to help, to make sure you don't have to walk through this world alone. She didn't know what to say to that. There were no words that could capture the turmoil inside her, the chaos that had been her life for so long. The world had stolen everything from her, her family, her home, her sense of safety. But he was offering her something different, something she hadn't known she needed until now, a future, a chance. Her breath caught in her throat as the weight of his words sank in. She wanted to scream, to run, to push him away. But there was no escaping it. There was no more running from the truth. She had lost everything, but that didn't mean she had to lose herself too. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't wipe them away. She didn't need to. For the first time, the tears didn't feel like weakness, they felt like release. The man watched her, his expression unreadable, but there was no judgment in his eyes, just understanding. And something else, something warmer. She stood up slowly, the ground beneath her feeling more solid than it had in days. The pain in her arm, the weakness in her legs, everything faded into the background. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. We can't change the past, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. But maybe we can start over, together. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her as if weighing her words. And then, finally, he nodded. Together, he agreed, his voice soft but firm. And in that moment, the girl realized something she had never truly understood until now. Survival wasn't just about fighting to stay alive. It was about fighting for something more, for hope, for a future, for the chance to rebuild what had been lost, and maybe, just maybe, with him by her side, she could do it.